The air hung heavy with the scent of rain and gunpowder when Zara Garrison stepped off the stagecoach into Fort Kearny, Nebraska territory. It was May 1867, and the town, a former military outpost now bustling with settlers heading west, was nothing like the Boston home she'd left behind. With shaking hands, she grasped her worn carpetbag, wincing at the pain that shot through her leg as her boot touched the muddy ground. "You sure this is where you want to be, miss?" The stagecoach driver eyed her skeptically as he tossed down her trunk. "Fort Kearny ain't exactly what I'd call hospitable for a lady traveling alone." "I'm certain," Zara replied, straightening her spine despite the throbbing in her injured leg. 3 weeks of rough travel had aggravated the old injury, but she wouldn't show weakness now. "My uncle's homestead is nearby. I'll manage." The driver shrugged, climbing back to his seat. "Suit yourself." Zara watched the stagecoach rumble away, dust billowing in its wake. She was 22 years old, alone in the Nebraska territory, with nothing but a trunk full of books, a carpetbag of clothes, and a letter from an uncle she hadn't seen in 15 years. The enormity of her decision crashed over her like a wave. Her leg buckled beneath her. "Looks like we've got another city gal thinking she can tame the frontier," a voice called out from the porch of the general store. Laughter rippled through the small group of men lounging there, watching her struggle. Her cheeks burned with humiliation as she tried again to stand, only to have her bad leg betray her once more. "They always come out here thinking it's some kind of adventure," another man chuckled. "Give it a week before she's begging for the next coach east." Zara gripped her carpetbag tighter, willing herself not to cry. She hadn't cried when her parents died of influenza last winter. She hadn't cried when she sold their modest home to pay off their debts. She certainly wouldn't cry now in front of these strangers. A shadow fell across her as she made a third attempt to rise. "Need a hand, madam?" She looked up into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-bronzed face beneath a worn Stetson. The man knelt beside her, his expression kind but guarded, offering his hand without presumption. "I can manage," she insisted, pride stinging. "No doubt you can," he replied, his voice low and steady, "but there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely." Something in his tone, the absence of mockery, made her relent. She placed her gloved hand in his, and he gently helped her to her feet. "Mitchell Porter," he introduced himself, steadying her with a strong arm. "Town Marshal." "Zara Garrison," she replied, trying to put weight on her leg and wincing. Marshal Porter frowned at the men on the porch, who suddenly found their boots very interesting. "Mrs. Holloway has rooms at the boarding house," he said, nodding toward a white 2-story building down the street. "Let me help you with your things." "It's Miss," she corrected automatically. "And I'm headed to my uncle's homestead, Charles Garrison." The marshal's expression shifted, something like concern crossing his features. "Charlie Garrison, out by the North Fork." "Yes, is there a problem?" He hesitated before answering. "No problem, just a fair piece from town." 12 miles at least, and not the easiest terrain. As if to emphasize his point, her leg gave way again. He caught her easily, his grip firm but gentle. "I will hold you taller," he said softly, for her ears alone, "until you can stand on your own again." The men on the porch had resumed their laughter, but Zara barely noticed. Something in the marshal's words and the quiet dignity with which he spoke them touched a place inside her that had grown cold since her parents' deaths. "Thank you," she whispered, leaning on him more than she intended. "First things first," Marshal Porter said, signaling to a young boy loitering nearby. "Jimmy, run fetch Doc Warren. Tell him we've got a lady who needs seeing to at Mrs. Holloway's." He turned back to Zara. "You'll stay in town tonight. Tomorrow's soon enough to think about reaching your uncle's place." But no arguments, Miss Garrison. That leg needs tending and nightfall's coming." His tone softened as he added, "Your uncle's waited this long. He can wait one more day." What Zara couldn't know then, as Marshal Porter helped her down the dusty main street of Fort Kearny, was that her uncle wouldn't be waiting at all, and that the journey she had embarked upon would lead her not to a family reunion, but to a destiny she could never have imagined in her sheltered Boston life. The widow Holloway's boarding house smelled of lye soap and baking bread. The older woman's sharp eyes took in Zara's pale face and the marshal's supportive arm without comment, but her mouth tightened at the corners. "Room at the back," she said, gesturing down a narrow hallway. "More private for the lady." "Much obliged, Mrs. Holloway," the marshal replied. He helped Zara to the indicated room, a small but clean space with a narrow bed, washstand, and a window overlooking a vegetable garden. "The doctor will be along shortly," he said, setting her trunk at the foot of the bed. "I'll check on your uncle's place tomorrow. Sometimes he comes into town for supplies, but it's been a while." Zara nodded, suddenly exhausted. "Thank you, Marshal Porter. You've been most kind." He hesitated at the door, hat in hand. "Folks call me Mitch," he said, "and it was no trouble. Fort Kearny's a rough place, but not everyone's like those fools on the porch." After he left, Zara sank onto the bed, massaging her aching leg through her skirt. The injury, a broken femur that had healed improperly after a riding accident when she was 16, rarely troubled her this badly. But the endless jostling of the stagecoach had inflamed it beyond bearing. Dr. Warren arrived an hour later, a gruff man with gentle hands who examined her leg with professional detachment. "Old break," he pronounced. "Healed crooked. Not much to be done now except rest it and apply these hot compresses. Stay off it for a few days." "I can't," Zara protested. "I need to reach my uncle's homestead." The doctor exchanged a glance with Mrs. Holloway, who had been hovering in the doorway. "Charlie Garrison's place. Marshall's gone to check on it. Rest up tonight, and we'll see what tomorrow brings." Something in their manner set alarm bells ringing in Zara's mind, but fatigue overcame her curiosity. After a simple supper brought by Mrs. Holloway, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She awoke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sounds of the town coming to life. For a moment, she imagined herself back in Boston, but the unfamiliar ceiling above her brought reality crashing back. A knock at the door preceded Mrs. Holloway, who entered with a breakfast tray. "Marshal Porter's back," the widow said without preamble. "Said he'd come by once you've eaten." "Has he seen my uncle?" Zara asked, pushing herself upright. Mrs. Holloway's expression softened with something like pity. "Best you hear it from him, dear." The food, eggs, bacon, and biscuits with honey suddenly held no appeal, but Zara forced herself to eat. Whatever news awaited, she would face it with strength. Marshal Porter arrived as she was finishing her tea. He removed his hat upon entering, and Zara knew from the somber set of his jaw what he was about to say. "Your uncle's gone, Miss Garrison," he said quietly. "Been gone almost 6 months now." The teacup trembled in her hand. "Dead," he nodded. "Pneumonia, according to neighbors. There was a bad spell last winter. Took several folks." Zara set the cup down carefully, fighting to keep her composure. "I see, and his property?" "The homestead's still there. Abandoned, though. Weather's been at it. Roof's half gone on the cabin." He hesitated before continuing. "There's a lawyer in town, Edward Freeman. Handles most of the legal matters hereabouts. Might know if your uncle left a will." "Thank you." Zara's voice sounded distant to her own ears. "I'll speak with him as soon as I'm able." The marshal studied her with those penetrating blue eyes. "You've no other family out here?" "None," she admitted. "My parents died last winter in Boston. Uncle Charles was my mother's brother, her only living relative. I wrote to him, but—" She trailed off, understanding now why she'd received no reply. "I'm sorry for your loss," Mitch said, genuine compassion in his voice. "Both of them." Zara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. All her careful plans, her last hope for a new beginning, had crumbled to dust. "What will you do?" he asked after a moment. It was a question she couldn't answer. Her funds were limited enough for a few weeks' lodging, perhaps, but not for a return to Boston. And even if she could afford it, there was nothing to return to. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'd still like to see my uncle's homestead if possible." Mitch hesitated. "It's rough country, especially for someone with a bad leg." "Nevertheless, it's all I have left of my family," she said firmly. "Once Dr. Warren says I'm fit to travel, I'd like to go." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of the same stubborn determination that had brought them both to this frontier outpost. "I'll take you myself," he finally said, "when you're ready." True to his word, 3 days later, Marshal Porter arrived at the boarding house with a wagon. Zara's leg had improved enough that she could walk with only a slight limp, though Dr. Warren had advised against traveling on horseback. "The wagon will be slower but easier on your leg," Mitch explained as he helped her up to the seat. He'd brought along blankets, food, and canteens of water, enough for a full day's journey. "The trail gets rough in places." They set out just after dawn, the spring sun warming the air as they left Fort Kearny behind. Zara watched the town recede, the military buildings giving way to scattered farms and then to open prairie. The land stretched vast around them, rolling hills covered with tall grasses that rippled like a golden green sea in the breeze. "It's beautiful," she murmured, more to herself than to her companion. "It is," Mitch agreed, his eyes scanning the horizon as he guided the horses. "Different from the East, I imagine." "Very. Everything there feels contained, fenced in. This is so open it almost hurts to look at it." He glanced at her, a hint of surprise in his expression. "Most Easterners I've met find it overwhelming, threatening even." "Oh, it is that too," Zara admitted with a small smile. "But there's something freeing about it as well." They traveled in companionable silence for a time, the wagon bumping along the rutted trail. Zara studied her companion surreptitiously. Marshal Mitch Porter was not what she'd expected in a frontier lawman. There was a quietness to him, a thoughtfulness that belied the rough exterior. His hands, though calloused, handled the reins with a gentle surety that spoke of control rather than force. "How long have you been marshal in Fort Kearny?" she asked as they stopped to rest the horses at a small creek. Mitch helped her down from the wagon before answering. "Going on 4 years now, came out after the war." "You fought?" He nodded, his expression closing slightly. "Union cavalry." "Saw action at Gettysburg, the Wilderness, enough to last a lifetime." Zara sensed the depths behind those simple statements, pain he didn't care to revisit. "My father was too old to serve," she said, "but we lost cousins on both sides. A lot of families did." He handed her a canteen. "Your leg holding up?" "Well enough." The pain was there, a dull throb but manageable. "How much farther to my uncle's place?" "Another hour or so." As they continued their journey, the landscape began to change. The open prairie gave way to more varied terrain, stands of cottonwood trees following the course of a small river, hills growing more pronounced, rocky outcroppings jutting from the earth like the bones of ancient creatures. "The North Fork," Mitch explained, pointing to the river. "Your uncle's place is just beyond that rise." The homestead, when they finally reached it, was a simple affair. A small cabin with a stone chimney, a barn leaning precariously to one side, a corral with broken rails, and what had once been a vegetable garden, now overgrown with weeds. A windmill creaked in the breeze, its wooden blades turning slowly despite missing several slats. Zara stared at the humble dwelling, this place her uncle had called home for the last decade of his life. The roof had partially collapsed, as Mitch had warned, exposing the interior to the elements. A wave of grief washed over her, not just for the uncle she barely remembered, but for the hope she'd placed in this reunion. "Would you like to go inside?" Mitch asked gently. She nodded, unable to speak. He helped her down and offered his arm for support as they made their way to the cabin. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, swinging open at Mitch's touch. The interior was spare but spoke of a life lived with purpose. A table and 2 chairs stood by the hearth. Shelves held a few books, jars of preserves and tools. A bed in the corner was still made up with a patchwork quilt, now spotted with mold from the rain that had come through the damaged roof. Zara moved slowly through the space, touching the rough wooden walls, the books on the shelf, practical volumes on farming, a Bible, a few dog-eared novels. Had her mother's brother found happiness here, alone on the edge of civilization? He was well respected, Mitch said, as if reading her thoughts. Quiet man, kept to himself mostly, but always willing to lend a hand to neighbors, good with horses. "Like my mother," Zara murmured. She could gentle the most skittish colt. She picked up a framed daguerreotype from beside the bed, a family portrait from years ago. Her mother, her uncle, and grandparents she'd never known. "This is all that's left," she said, clutching the picture. "All that remains of my family." Mitch stood quietly, allowing her this moment of grief. When she finally turned to him, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling, he didn't offer empty platitudes or awkward comfort. Instead, he simply held out his hand. "Let's check the barn before we head back," he suggested. "Your uncle kept good stock. Might be something worth salvaging." The barn, though weathered, had fared better than the cabin. Inside, dusty tack hung from pegs and tools lined the walls. A workbench held leather working tools and half-finished projects. But it was the trunk in the corner that caught Zara's attention. "May I?" she asked, kneeling beside it. "It's your uncle's property," Mitch reminded her. "Yours now, most likely." The trunk was locked, but the key hung on a nail above it. Inside, Zara found clothes, personal items, and at the bottom, a stack of letters tied with twine. With trembling fingers, she untied the bundle. The topmost envelope bore her name, dated just 2 months before his death. "He wrote to me," she whispered, unfolding the pages, "but never sent it." The letter was brief but heartfelt, an invitation to come west, to make a new home with him. He spoke of the beauty of the prairie, the freedom of the frontier. The land was hard, he wrote, but rewarding for those willing to work it. He had missed his family, missed watching her grow up. There was a place for her here if she wanted it. Tears blurred her vision as she read the closing lines. "I have lived alone too long, and regret the years lost. It would bring me great joy to have family near again in my final years." "He wanted me here," she said, looking up at Mitch. "If only I'd written sooner." The marshal's face softened with sympathy. "You couldn't have known." "No." She carefully folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. "But I'm here now." They gathered what they could from the homestead, the letters, the daguerreotype, a few personal items that had belonged to her uncle. As they prepared to leave, Zara stood looking back at the cabin, her heart heavy with what might have been. "The land is still good," Mitch said beside her. "Your uncle proved up on his claim, 160 acres according to the Homestead Act. It's legally yours if Freeman confirms there's a will." "What would I do with a homestead?" Zara asked, more to herself than to him. "Whatever you choose," he replied simply. "Sell it, work it. It's your decision." The sun was lowering toward the western horizon as they loaded the trunk and other salvaged items into the wagon. They would need to make haste to reach Fort Kearny before full dark. As Mitch helped her up to the seat, Zara took one last look at the homestead. For the first time since arriving in Nebraska, she felt a strange sense of rightness, of belonging. This land had been her uncle's dream, his home. Perhaps it could be hers as well. The journey back to Fort Kearny was quieter, both of them lost in thought as the wagon bumped along the trail. Shadows lengthened across the prairie, and the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. "Will you be taking the next stage east?" Mitch asked as they crested a hill, the lights of Fort Kearny visible in the distance. The question caught Zara off guard. I don't know," she admitted. "I came west because I had nowhere else to go. That hasn't changed." "You could stay," he suggested, his voice carefully neutral. "Fort Kearny's growing. The town needs a school teacher." "A school teacher? What makes you think I could teach?" He nodded toward the trunk in the back of the wagon, where several books she'd brought from Boston were visible. "Most folks out here don't travel with a library, and you speak like someone who's had education." "I was a governess in Boston," she admitted. "After my parents died, it was not a happy situation. The town council's been trying to establish a proper school, buildings already up but no teacher yet." He glanced at her. "Just a thought." The idea took root in her mind as they continued toward town. A school, a purpose. A reason to stay in this wild, beautiful place that had been her uncle's home. "I'll consider it," she said finally, as the wagon rolled onto the main street of Fort Kearny. Attorney Edward Freeman confirmed 2 days later what Zara had dared to hope her uncle had indeed left: a will, naming her as his sole heir. The homestead, with its 160 acres, was legally hers, along with a small sum of money kept in the Fort Kearny bank. "Not a fortune," Freeman cautioned, "but enough to make repairs to the property if you choose to keep it, or to establish yourself elsewhere if you prefer to sell." The town council, when approached about the teaching position, was enthusiastic. Fort Kearny had 15 school-age children with no formal education, and more families arriving each month as the railroad pushed westward. "We can offer room and board plus a modest salary," the council chairman explained. The school term would run from September through May, weather permitting. It was more than Zara had dared to hope for: a home, a purpose, independence. By the end of her first week in Fort Kearny, she had secured the teaching position and begun making arrangements for repairs to the homestead, which she decided to keep as a summer residence. Through it all, Marshal Porter maintained a respectful distance, though he checked on her progress regularly. There was something in his manner, a careful restraint that both intrigued and frustrated Zara. He was unfailingly kind, but seemed determined to keep their interactions firmly in the realm of neighborly assistance. It was Mrs. Holloway who finally shed light on the matter one evening as Zara helped her shell peas on the boarding house porch. "The Marshal's had his share of sorrows," the widow said, her fingers working deftly. "Lost his wife and child in a fire back in Ohio before the war. Some say that's why he fought so recklessly, hoping the rebels would finish what grief began." "How terrible," Zara murmured, thinking of the quiet strength in Mitch's eyes, the careful way he held himself apart from others. "He's a good man," Mrs. Holloway continued. "Best marshal this town's had, fair to all, even the Indians and freed slaves passing through. But he keeps to himself, mostly. Doesn't let folks get close." Zara thought of how he had steadied her that first day, his quiet promise, "I will hold you taller." Had anyone done the same for him in his grief? Summer unfurled across the prairie in a riot of wildflowers and tall grasses. Zara divided her time between preparing for the school term and overseeing repairs to the homestead. A local carpenter fixed the roof and repaired the barn. A pair of brothers cleared and replanted the garden with vegetables that would mature by fall. Mitch often found reasons to ride out that way, checking on neighboring farms. He claimed, though Zara suspected the detours were deliberate. He never stayed long, but always found time to help with some small task, mending a fence, fixing the windmill, showing her how to use her uncle's rifle for protection. "A woman alone needs to be able to defend herself," he explained as they stood behind the cabin, an impromptu shooting range set up with cans on a fallen log. "Not just from two-legged predators, but four-legged ones too. Wolves come down from the hills sometimes." Zara had never fired a weapon before, but she was a quick study. The rifle's kick bruised her shoulder the first few times, but she gritted her teeth and continued practicing until she could hit the targets consistently. "Good," Mitch nodded with approval. "You're a natural." "I doubt that," she laughed, rubbing her sore shoulder. "But I'm stubborn." "That you are, Miss Garrison." His rare smile transformed his face, erasing the habitual wariness and revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been before grief carved its lines into him. As July turned to August, the heat lay heavy on the land. Days were spent in the relative cool of the repaired cabin or under the shade of the cottonwoods by the North Fork. Zara discovered the simple pleasures of frontier life, the taste of water drawn fresh from the well, the satisfaction of tending her small garden, the profound stillness of prairie nights under a canopy of stars. She was sitting on the cabin's porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, when the sound of hoofbeats made her look up. Mitch rode into the yard, his expression uncharacteristically troubled. "Evening, Marshal," she called, rising to meet him. "Is everything all right?" He dismounted, removing his hat. "Just a warning. There's been trouble north of here. Band of deserters from Fort Laramie causing problems for homesteaders. Robbery mostly, but they've turned violent when resisted." Concern tightened her chest. "How close?" "About 20 miles. Army's after them, but thought you should know. Might be best if you stayed in town until they're caught." Zara glanced at the cabin, so recently repaired, at the garden beginning to yield its first harvest. "I've only just gotten the place habitable." "It'll be here when it's safe," Mitch said firmly. "I'd feel better knowing you were in town." Something in his tone, the edge of personal concern beneath the professional warning, made her relent. "Very well. Let me gather a few things." As she packed a small bag, Zara reflected on how quickly this place had become home. The thought of abandoning it, even temporarily, left an ache in her chest. But practicality won out over sentiment. She was still learning to shoot, still adapting to frontier life. A confrontation with armed deserters was more than she was prepared to handle. The ride back to Fort Kearny was tense, with Mitch scanning the horizon frequently. Night had fallen by the time they reached town, and Mrs. Holloway had already retired, though she'd left a lamp burning for Zara's return. "I'll check on the homestead when I can," Mitch promised as he helped her down from her horse outside the boarding house. "Make sure everything's as you left it." "Thank you." Zara hesitated, then added, "Please be careful. These men sound dangerous." His expression softened momentarily. "I always am." But 3 days later, the danger Mitch had warned about arrived in Fort Kearny itself. Zara was in the schoolhouse, arranging desks and unpacking books in preparation for the coming term, when she heard shouting from the direction of the bank. She stepped to the window just in time to see 4 men on horseback galloping down the main street, guns drawn. Behind them, the bank manager stumbled out the door, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Stop! Thieves!" he shouted, though the riders were already disappearing in a cloud of dust. Moments later, Mitch burst from the marshal's office, running toward his horse tied outside the saloon. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, as he mounted a silent exchange that held both warning and reassurance. Then he was gone, galloping after the bank robbers with a determination that sent fear coursing through Zara's veins. The town buzzed with tension as the hours passed with no sign of the marshal's return. By late afternoon, a posse had formed and gone after him, led by the blacksmith who served as deputy when needed. Night fell, and still no word. Zara paced the floor of her room at the boarding house, unable to eat, unable to concentrate on anything but the thought of Mitch facing 4 desperate men alone. It was past midnight when she heard the commotion in the street, horses, voices, the creak of wagon wheels. She threw a shawl around her shoulders and hurried outside, joining the crowd gathering in front of the doctor's office. The posse had returned, bringing with them a wagon. In it lay Marshal Porter, his shirt soaked with blood, face ashen in the lamplight. "Shot twice," the blacksmith was explaining to the gathering crowd. "Got 2 of the robbers before they got him. Other 2 escaped, but they won't get far. Army patrol's been alerted." Zara pushed through the crowd as they carried Mitch into the doctor's office. "Let me help," she insisted when Mrs. Holloway tried to pull her back. "I've nursed before during the influenza outbreak that took my parents." Dr. Warren, already rolling up his sleeves, gave her a sharp look before nodding. "Extra hands are welcome. This will be messy." Messy was an understatement. 1 bullet had torn through Mitch's shoulder, missing major vessels but fracturing bone. The second had grazed his side, leaving a deep furrow that bled profusely but looked worse than it was. For 2 hours, Zara assisted the doctor holding instruments, applying pressure to wounds, bathing Mitch's face as fever took hold. Through it all, the marshal remained unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. Only once did he stir, when the doctor was probing for the bullet in his shoulder. His eyes flickered open, finding Zara's face above him. "You're safe," he murmured, more statement than question. "Yes," she whispered, stroking damp hair back from his forehead. "Rest now." He slipped back into unconsciousness as the doctor continued his work. Dawn was breaking when Dr. Warren finally straightened, wiping blood from his hands. "That's all I can do," he said wearily. "The shoulder's bad, but he's strong. If infection doesn't set in, he has a good chance." "I'll stay with him," Zara volunteered, already settling into a chair beside the treatment table. The doctor studied her with tired eyes. "He's not out of danger yet, Miss Garrison. Might be a long vigil. I have nowhere else I need to be." For 3 days and nights, Zara barely left Mitch's side, sleeping in snatches in the chair beside his bed, bathing his fevered skin with cool cloths, changing bandages and coaxing broth between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Zara was dozing in her chair when Mitch's voice, weak but clear, pulled her from sleep. "You're still here," she blinked, straightening quickly. "Where else would I be?" His blue eyes, dulled with pain but alert, studied her face. "You look exhausted," says the man who chased down 4 bank robbers single-handed, she countered, pouring him water from the pitcher beside the bed. A ghost of his rare smile touched his lips. "Not my finest decision." "No," she agreed, helping him sit up enough to drink. "But a brave one." He winced as the movement pulled at his wounds. "Did they recover the money?" "Most of it. The army caught the remaining 2 robbers near the Kansas border." She set the glass down. "The whole town's been worried about you." "The whole town?" "Well," she amended, holding his gaze steadily, "some more than others." Something shifted in his expression, then a softening, a lowering of the careful guard he maintained. His hand, weak but deliberate, reached for hers. "Thank you, Zara," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time. "For staying." She curled her fingers around his. "You once said you would hold me taller until I could stand on my own. Perhaps it's my turn to do the same for you." Recovery was slow and fraught with setbacks. The shoulder wound became infected a week after the shooting, requiring Dr. Warren to reopen and clean it, an excruciating procedure that left Mitch sweating and gray-faced. The town council appointed the blacksmith as acting marshal, but it was clear to everyone that Mitch's position would be waiting when he was well enough to return. As August gave way to September, Zara began her teaching duties while continuing to visit Mitch daily. The school term started with 17 children ranging from 6 to 14 years of age, a challenging group with widely varying levels of education. Some could read fluently, others didn't know their letters. Zara threw herself into the work, developing lessons that would engage all her students while allowing each to progress at their own pace. She found unexpected joy in teaching. The children were eager to learn, their minds uncluttered by the social pretensions that had characterized her pupils in Boston. Here on the frontier, practical knowledge was valued above all reading, writing, arithmetic, natural history. But Zara also introduced them to poetry, art, and music, believing that beauty had a place even in this harsh land. By early October, Mitch was well enough to move from the doctor's office to his small quarters behind the marshal's office. His arm remained in a sling and he tired easily, but the worst danger had passed. "Doc says I can resume light duties next week," he told Zara one evening as they sat on the bench outside his quarters, watching the sunset. "Desk work, mostly. Are you certain you're ready?" She asked, noting the way he still held himself carefully to avoid jarring his shoulder. "Ready or not, the town needs its marshal back. The blacksmith's a good man, but he's got his own business to run." Zara studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the thoughtful set of his mouth. Over the weeks of his recovery, something had changed between them, the careful distance he had maintained giving way to a tentative closeness. Their conversations had deepened, touching on hopes, fears, and memories both painful and sweet. He had told her, haltingly, of his wife Sarah and infant son James, lost in the fire that had driven him to war and then to the frontier. She had shared the grief of losing her parents, the humiliations she had endured as a governess in a household where the master's attentions had become increasingly inappropriate. "What of your homestead?" Mitch asked, turning to face her. "School's in session now, but you'll have time on weekends." "Will you be riding out there?" "I've been thinking about that," Zara admitted. "It's too far for regular visits, especially as winter approaches. I've been considering selling." "Selling?" Surprise colored his voice. "After all the work you put into repairs, the land is valuable." "I could use the money to build a small house here in town, closer to the school." She hesitated, then added, "Unless you think that's foolish." "Not foolish," he said slowly, "but I've seen how you love that place. The way your face lights up when you talk about the garden, the river, the open space." "I do love it," she acknowledged, "but it's impractical for a woman alone." Mitch was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the sunset. When he finally spoke, his voice held a note she hadn't heard before, a vulnerability beneath the usual steadiness. "What if you weren't alone?" The simple question hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Zara's heart quickened as she turned to find him watching her, his blue eyes intense with an emotion he'd kept carefully hidden until now. "Mitch," she whispered, hardly daring to believe what he seemed to be suggesting. He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I've been alone a long time, Zara. Thought it was better that way, safer. But these past months, watching you build a life here, seeing your courage and determination, it's woken something in me I thought was dead and buried. What are you saying?" she asked, though she felt it in the trembling of his hand in hers, saw it in the naked hope in his eyes. "I'm saying I care for you, more than I should, perhaps, more than I've allowed myself to care for anyone since Sarah." He drew a deep breath. "I'm saying that if you wanted to keep the homestead, you wouldn't have to manage it alone." Joy bloomed in Zara's chest, bright and unexpected. "Are you proposing, Marshal Porter?" A smile, the full, unguarded smile she'd seen so rarely, transformed his face. "I reckon I am, Miss Garrison. Though I'd planned something more romantic than sitting on a bench with my arm in a sling." Zara laughed, tears of happiness pricking her eyes. "I think it's perfectly romantic." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, two people who had known loss finding their way back to hope in each other's arms. When they finally parted, Mitch rested his forehead against hers, his good arm holding her close. "Is that a yes?" he murmured. "Yes," she whispered back. 1,000 times yes. They were married on a crisp November day in the newly completed church, with half the town in attendance. Mrs. Holloway wept openly, declaring she'd known all along they were meant for each other. Dr. Warren gave the bride away, and the school children sang a song they'd secretly practiced under the tutelage of the blacksmith's wife. Winter descended on the prairie with a fury that confirmed Zara's decision to remain in town until spring. The newlyweds moved into Mitch's quarters, made cozier by Zara's feminine touches and the wedding gifts from townspeople: quilts, curtains, cooking pots, and a fine rocking chair crafted by the carpenter who had repaired her uncle's cabin. Mitch returned to full duty as marshal by Christmas, though his shoulder troubled him in cold weather. Zara continued teaching, finding in her pupils a joy that filled her days with purpose. Evenings were spent in domestic contentment, reading aloud by lamplight, planning improvements to the homestead for spring, learning the rhythms of married life after years of solitude for them both. "You ever regret it?" Mitch asked one night as they lay together in the darkness, snow falling soft outside the window. "Coming west, staying in Fort Kearny." Zara nestled closer, her head on his shoulder. "Not for a moment. My only regret is not coming sooner when my uncle was still alive." "He would be proud of you," Mitch said, stroking her hair. "Taking on the school, making the homestead thrive again." "We haven't done much thriving there yet," she reminded him with a smile. "Just repairs." "Wait until spring," he promised. "We'll plant corn and wheat, maybe get some cattle. Build a bigger garden, make it a proper home." Home. The word held such promise now, so different from when she'd arrived in May, alone and uncertain. She had found not just shelter but belonging, not just a place but a purpose, and most precious of all, not just companionship but love. Spring came to the prairie in a rush of green, the land awakening from winter's grip with explosive growth. As promised, Mitch and Zara divided their time between town and the homestead, riding out each Friday after school and returning Sunday evening. The cabin that had seemed so desolate the previous summer now rang with laughter and conversation. They worked side by side, planting, building, planning. Mitch taught her to ride properly, mindful of her bad leg, but insisting she learn to manage a horse on her own. "Freedom," he explained as she mastered the western saddle, growing confident enough to ride without his constant supervision. "That's what the horse gives you out here. Freedom to cover distances, to not be tied to one place." By summer's end, the homestead had been transformed. The garden yielded more vegetables than they could eat, the excess preserved in jars for winter. A small herd of cattle grazed in the north pasture. The barn housed 2 horses and a milk cow. Most significantly, An addition had been built onto the cabin, a second bedroom, in anticipation of the child they hoped would come. Their hopes were realized in early autumn, when Zara confirmed what she had suspected for weeks. The baby would arrive in late spring, after the school term ended. "Perfect timing," Mitch declared, his face alight with joy as he placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "We'll be at the homestead by then. Our child will be born in our home." The school board was supportive, arranging for a replacement teacher to finish the term if needed. The town buzzed with excitement at the news, the marshal and the schoolteacher, bringing new life to Fort Kearny. As Zara's pregnancy progressed, Mitch became increasingly protective, insisting she ride in the wagon rather than on horseback for their weekend trips to the homestead. He took on more of the physical labor, though Zara remained active, determined not to be treated as an invalid. "I'm carrying a child, not suffering an affliction," she reminded him when he tried to prevent her from helping with the spring planting. "Women have been working the land while pregnant since time began." But she conceded to his concern in other ways, resting when tired, accepting help with tasks that strained her increasingly ungainly form. Her bad leg troubled her more as the pregnancy advanced, the added weight aggravating the old injury. It was on a warm May afternoon, almost exactly a year after her arrival in Fort Kearny, that Zara felt the first labor pains while working in the homestead garden. Mitch was in the north pasture, checking on a calf born the previous week. "Not yet, little one," she murmured to her swollen belly. "Your father isn't back," but the baby had other ideas. By the time Mitch returned an hour later, the pains were coming regularly, and Zara knew this was not a false alarm. "The baby's coming," she told him calmly as he helped her into the cabin. "We won't make it back to town." Panic flashed across his face before he mastered it. "I'll ride for the doctor." "No time," she said, gripping his hand as another contraction seized her. "This is happening fast. You'll have to help me." The fear in his eyes was palpable. "Zara, I don't know how, neither do I," she admitted with a strained laugh. "But women have been doing this forever and will manage." She squeezed his hand. "I trust you, Mitch. We'll do this together." For hours they labored, Zara working with each contraction, Mitch supporting her with a steadiness that belied his terror. As night fell, he lit lamps, built up the fire, and prepared clean linens and water as Zara directed between pains. "Tell me about Sarah," Zara asked during a brief respite, her body damp with sweat, her voice hoarse from exertion. "Did she give birth in a hospital?" Mitch nodded, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. "In Cleveland. Everything proper and medical, nothing like this." "Was it a difficult birth?" "No," he said softly. "Quick and easy, they said. James came into the world howling, red-faced and perfect." Zara smiled through her exhaustion. "Our child will be perfect too." In the end, it happened quickly, a final, tremendous effort as dawn was breaking. Mitch caught his son as he slid into the world, tiny and indignant, announcing his arrival with a lusty cry that filled the cabin. "A boy," Mitch whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the infant on Zara's chest. "We have a son." Zara cradled the tiny form, marveling at the perfection of his fingers, the dark hair plastered to his head, the blue eyes that blinked up at her in the early morning light. "Charles," she said, looking up at Mitch. "After my uncle, and James after your first son, Charles James Porter." Tears streamed unashamedly down Mitch's face as he nodded. "Perfect." In the days that followed, as Zara recovered her strength and they marveled at their son's perfection, visitors began to arrive from town, Mrs. Holloway with food and baby clothes, Dr. Warren to check on mother and child, the blacksmith with a cradle he had crafted as a surprise. "The whole town's been waiting for this baby," Mrs. Holloway declared, rocking little Charlie while Zara rested. First child born to a marshal and a school teacher, he'll be the pride of Fort Kearny. Mitch, watching from the doorway, caught Zara's eye over the widow's head. The look that passed between them held all the wonder of their journey from that first meeting when she couldn't stand, and he had promised to hold her taller, to this moment, with their son cradled in the arms of a woman who had become family. Life settled into a new rhythm with Charlie's arrival. Zara took a year's leave from teaching, focusing on motherhood and the homestead. Mitch continued his duties as marshal but arranged for the deputy to cover more shifts, allowing him to spend more time with his family. Charlie thrived in the prairie air, growing strong and curious. By his first birthday, he was toddling around the cabin, exploring his world with a determination that reminded Zara of both his parents. The summer Charlie turned 2, Zara discovered she was expecting again. This time, heeding Dr. Warren's advice, they planned to be in town as her time approached. The journey was easier with proper preparation, and their daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Porter, was born in the doctor's office with professional assistance. 2 perfect children, Mitch marveled as he held his newborn daughter, Charlie peering curiously at his sister from Zara's lap. More than I ever dared hope for. Fort Kearny grew and prospered as the railroad brought more settlers west. The school expanded to 2 rooms, and when Zara returned to teaching after Sarah's birth, she took charge of the older students while a young woman from Omaha taught the younger children. The homestead remained their weekend and summer residence, a place of peace away from the growing bustle of town. They added more land, purchased from neighboring homesteaders who decided to move on, until the Porter Ranch encompassed 400 acres of prime Nebraska territory. 5 years after Zara's arrival, the town council approached Mitch about running for mayor. Fort Kearny had outgrown its frontier beginnings, they argued, and needed leadership that understood both law and progress. "They're right," Zara told him when he hesitated. "You've done your part with a badge and gun. Maybe it's time to build in other ways." He was elected by a landslide, hanging up his marshal's star to take on civic duties. Under his leadership, Fort Kearny established a proper courthouse, a second school, and a small hospital. Life was not without challenges. Zara's leg continued to trouble her periodically. Charlie, at 8, fell from a horse and broke his arm badly. A drought nearly destroyed their crops one summer. Sarah developed pneumonia at 4 and hovered between life and death for a terrifying week. But through it all, they faced each trial together, drawing strength from the bond that had formed in those early days when a Boston governess with a bad leg had found herself laughing stock in a frontier town, and a lonely marshal had promised to hold her taller. 10 years to the day after Zara stepped off the stagecoach, they held a celebration at the homestead. Friends from town, Mrs. Holloway, now gray-haired but still spry, Dr. Warren, the blacksmith and his wife, and dozens of others who had become part of their extended family gathered for a feast under the cottonwood trees. As the sun began to set, Mitch found Zara standing alone by the North Fork, watching the golden light play across the water. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, slipping an arm around her waist. She leaned into him, comfortable in the embrace that had become home. "I was thinking about that first day, how they laughed when I couldn't stand, how humiliated I felt. And now look at you," he said with pride. "Respected teacher, mother of 2 fine children, mistress of all you survey." He gestured to the prosperous homestead, the gathering of friends, their children playing tag in the failing light. "It wasn't easy," she acknowledged, "building a life here. The best things rarely are." He turned her gently to face him, his blue eyes as clear and steady as when they'd first met, though crinkled now with laugh lines. "Any regrets?" Zara thought of the journey that had brought her here, the loss and pain that had driven her west, the uncertainty and fear she had overcome, the love she had found when she least expected it. "Not one," she answered truthfully, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Not a single one." As they walked back to join their guests, arms around each other, Zara reflected on the words that had changed her life a decade ago. "I will hold you taller." Mitch had kept that promise. But what neither of them had known then was how they would lift each other up through the years, how they would stand taller together than either could alone. In the gathering dusk, with their children running ahead and friends waiting to toast their happiness, Zara Garrison Porter knew herself truly blessed, not despite the hardships that had brought her to this frontier, but because of them. For it was in facing those challenges that she had found her strength, her purpose, and the love that had transformed a broken-hearted widower and a limping Eastern girl into something greater than the sum of their parts. The prairie wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the laughter of their children and the promise of tomorrow. And in that moment, Zara knew that this land, this life, this love was exactly where she was meant to be.